Assalamu alaikum, Haris. Thank you for joining us.
Walaikum assalam. Thank you for having me, Michael and Bashar.
So we have Brother Haris Irfan with us today. Haris is going to be one of the main keynote speakers at the Muslim Bitcoin Summit in London in October, on October the 10th and the 11th. Haris is the author of the book Heaven's Bankers, which is a very good and informative book that I think all Muslims should read if they want to understand a bit more about Islamic finance and actually what the realities of Islamic finance. That book is a great read because Haris is a veteran of the Islamic finance industry. So yes, over to you, Haris. I'll let you introduce yourself properly, and then we can get into some conversations.
Sure. Jazakallah khair. Thank you very much for having me. And I must say I'm very much looking forward to the Muslim Bitcoin Summit because I think there's a collection of individuals who bring a complete universe of the perspective of Muslims in finance, in trade, in economics, in Bitcoin. And my background is I'm an investment banker. I'm an ex-investment banker with what they call bulge bracket firms, which are the big international investment banks. I was with Deutsche Bank for 11 years and Barclays for 2. And I was with a boutique as well, which was I'm going to use the word alleged Islamic finance institution. Since then or during that time, I became very disillusioned with what's happening in the fiat Islamic finance world, which I found to be not really an alternative economic system as it was presenting itself, but more a subset of conventional finance. And I always felt that as an insider, I could be the one to change that with, like-minded colleagues. And the reality was we were fighting too big a monster. And I think that there are devices and tools that we can use collectively to become a strong ummah, a strong body, who are economically empowered, who are independent, who can project soft power and influence around the world. I think that the nature of money is probably the most fundamental question to answer when we're addressing the concept of ummatic influence. And that's what led me to Bitcoin. So I am still an investment banker in a sense. I run a company. I founded a company which has tried to go back to the prophetic model of economics, which I consider to be mudaraba, and I'll explain that a little bit later. So how did Islamic finance really start 1400 years ago? And do Islamic banks do that today? The answer is, I'm sure my answer is no. So what I tried to do was to create a company that would work within the existing system right now to create that model, but in an international capital markets format. Now, that of course means that I am not working currently in a Bitcoin format, but I very much hope that one day that will be the case.
Inshallah.
What were the things that annoyed you while you were working in so-called Islamic finance? What were the first things that led you to think something is wrong?
So I'm now going to go back, I guess, 25 years or so. In those early days of what I would call Islamic finance 2.0. Because the reason I say that is because Islamic finance really started in the early 60s and mid 70s with the introduction of commercial Islamic financing in a modern sense. So that was the introduction of the first Islamic bank in 1975. And then the Malaysians came in the 1980s. Then you had Citibank and HSBC in the 1990s. And I guess my journey starts around the time of Citibank and HSBC. And there were always, in those early days, a group of practicing values-aligned Muslims, young, well-educated, technically very proficient, who wanted to do the right thing. They wanted to create an alternative economic system that accorded with their faith, that removed riba from their lives, interest. And for a while, we thought we were cracking it. We thought we'd cracked the code. And so, for example, when I was with Deutsche Bank, they moved me to Dubai in the early 2000s, and I co-founded the Islamic finance team there. And we started doing the very first benchmark-sized sukuk transactions. So what does that mean? Benchmark means they are typically $500 million to $1 billion each. They're typically issued by a government that's raising money on the international capital markets or a very large corporation. And these sukuk, or Islamic bonds, were supposed to be asset-backed. In other words, they were taking the risk of a real trade or a real asset, and they were giving investors the return from that asset. So in those early days, we started creating these Islamic bonds on the basis of risk-sharing contracts from fiqh, from jurisprudence, fiqh al-mu'amalat, which is the jurisprudence of transactions, of commercial transactions. And we were very pleased with ourselves. We started using concepts like musharaka and mudaraba, which are risk-sharing financing concepts where the investor and the investee company are sharing the risks and rewards of a trade. And that's very prophetic in its nature. Unfortunately, very quickly, these early attempts to create in Islamic Finance 2.0 from the early 2000s, when Deutsche Bank came on the scene, these attempts to create these very large, sophisticated capital markets transactions in a risk-sharing way, in a prophetic way, in an asset-backed way, became distorted. And the investment banks were very uncomfortable with this idea of issuing these bonds or an instrument in a bond-like format, which actually requires you to do some due diligence. Is this a good trade? Is it a bad trade? What are the risks? What are the mitigants? And very quickly, these sukuk started to morph and transform into what looked and felt like a bond, an interest-bearing, coupon-paying, LIBOR-linked, LIBOR is the interest rate benchmark, LIBOR-linked bond with some fancy Arabic words around it. And so, a lot of us became very disillusioned. By the time the global financial crisis hit, many of the big investment banks had decided to focus on their core business because this Islamic business, they didn't quite understand it. It seemed a little bit risky, and then they moved away from it. So that meant that you had a cohort of Islamic bankers and Islamic finance specialists who were milling around the market looking for work, ended up in the regional and domestic specialist Islamic banks, which are quite sleepy, parochial institutions. They didn't really move the game on, and they continued to transact in these old-fashioned and synthetic ways. There's a good analogy, actually, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a book by an author called Tariq al-Diwani called The Problem with Interest, who is a bit of a cult figure for those of us, both in the Islamic finance and the Bitcoin world. He's considered a bit of a legend, mashallah. And he wrote a book in the mid-90s called The Problem with Interest. And when I read it at the time, it didn't quite strike me as, well, let's put it this way. When I read it, I knew that it was something powerful. I knew that I'd read something that was very helpful and useful to explain to me how the monetary system works. But it wasn't until someone introduced me to Bitcoin and I had my orange pill moment that that book clicked for me. And I realized what the problem was. And the problem with Islamic banking was it was always founded in, it was anchored in the fiat world. So Islamic banks, despite the fact that they're Islamic because they have halal contracts like musharaka, mudaraba, and so on, they're actually money creation vehicles. They are there to create money whenever they lend. And it's that concept of lending that they haven't got away from. So whenever you talk to an Islamic banker, they'll almost always say to you, oh, we lent such and such this money, or the borrower did this. They talk in terms of lender-borrower, which is an asymmetric relationship. It's not a partnership at all. There's no equality or symmetry between them. This is a master-servant relationship. And Islamic finance was never meant to be about that. It was meant to be about having a partnership with people, a healthy economy in which the one who is being invested in and the one who is providing capital are partners, are equal partners with each other, with different roles and responsibilities. So that was always something that I always felt uncomfortable with. There is a type of contract that is prevalent in the Islamic banking and the Islamic finance world. It's a contract called commodity murabaha. Sometimes it's referred to as tawarruq. And whilst I don't want to get into the intricacies and the technical details of exactly how it works, there's an analogy that Tariq al-Diwani used in his book. And he talked about a medieval construct. In the Middle Ages, there was a type of contract or three contracts called contractum trinius. And individually, each contract was not a loan with interest. And the church had banned usury. So in Christianity, usury, interest, was always haram. It was always forbidden. And yet today, there seems to be no injunction against interest anymore. The church itself invests in bonds. In fact, I remember the Church of England was an anchor investor in Wonga. I don't know if you remember Wonga. It was a
Payday loan.
it was a payday lender,
The
very
most predatory of them all. Yeah.
very predatory. Really, the worst kind of institution to invest in. And so, the church has kind of forgotten those roots, which is a crying shame. And at the time in the Middle Ages, the financiers were very clever, and they realized they could circumvent this ban by introducing 3 separate contracts called contractum trinius, and thereby creating a loan with interest. And the church probably looked at it and said, well, I can't see any problem with the individual contract, so it's fine. And eventually, all Christians use riba without realizing that it's haram for them. So I fear that the Islamic finance industry is headed this way, and our version of contractum trinius is the commodity murabaha or tawarruq. And I still see people online defending it and saying, well, there's reasons why we use it. There's tax reasons, and there's legislation, and there's other reasons. And that's why after we've exhausted all possibilities, we've gone down this path of commodity murabaha, and therefore it's allowed by the scholars. Well, I'm sorry, I'm not buying that, because the usual analogy, if it, looks like a duck and walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, then it is a duck. I'm tired of people defending this commodity murabaha and defending Islamic banking and defending money creation as if, well, yahi, what's the problem here? What choice do we have? We need to do these things. We need to start from some. Mate, you've started 60 years ago. 1963 was the first experiment in modern Islamic finance. We're here 63 years later, and you're still talking about commodity murabaha. Give me a break. I'm sorry. I'm not buying this anymore. And I know that there's alternatives that can work. Why? Because I've created a company to do that, and it's commercially viable. So
also the consumer doesn't buy it. Like
yeah,
the general sentiment among people, though they don't understand how the mechanics of it work, but they many people I hear they feel it, that Islamic banking is like or even worse than the conventional banking.
I massively empathize with that. My estimation based on my numbers is that the UK market has a penetration rate, probably 3 to 4% of Muslims in this country have an Islamic bank account or Islamic mortgage or other product. Now, that's a pitiful, pathetic number. Why? Because the Islamic banks in this country had a pretty much monopoly position. The market was theirs for the taking, and they missed their opportunity. And another reason why the industry annoys me is because when I look at who is running that industry, they do not look or sound like or think like or have the life experiences that you and I have. They don't have an affinity with the people that they're serving, with the customer base, and they come from retail banking backgrounds. So all they're doing is transplanting what they already know in conventional banking into an Islamic bank. And then they'll sit in conferences on panels and they'll say things like, well, I'm not a Muslim and I'm not an expert on Sharia, but my understanding of Sharia is, and then they'll proceed to tell you what they're understanding. And I'm thinking, mate, why are you even bothering to? It's embarrassing, really. I'm embarrassed on your behalf that you are, you have the stupidity to tell me that your understanding of Sharia is this. How can you possibly do that? So I understand why Muslim customers are staying away from Islamic banks, and their eyes are closed. They're blind. They're blind and deaf to this. They don't seem to realize why they're not getting the penetration and the traction that they should be getting in a near monopoly position. So as far as I'm concerned, certainly in the UK, it's an abject failure. Around the world, you'll see different examples. The Malaysians have been successful commercially. There are a lot of non-Muslims who also are users of Islamic financial services. In the Gulf, it's again, there's a relatively high penetration rate. But again, we come back to this idea that are we merely trying to deceive God? There are enough Muslims around the world who are not engaging with the Islamic financing and Islamic banking industry because they intuitively know, without being a finance specialist, something is not right here.
Yeah, definitely.
This looks and feels like a bank to me. Well, what's the difference? So we haven't won hearts and minds. We haven't given them an alternative that they emotionally, with their heart, that they buy into. They're not buying into it. When you want to convince someone of something, you don't use logic. I wish we could, because I'm a logical person. I like logic. But when I try and use logic on, and I try not to explain Bitcoin on a logical basis, because I know it's not going to work.
Yeah.
I try and appeal to emotion. We talk about things like cost of living crisis and stewardship of the planet. What do you care about? What's your agenda? What's your motivation? What matters to you in your life? Is it your children? Is it the environment? Well, how can we address these matters by addressing the subject of Islamic finance or sound money? So I think that's the angle that tends to work with people. And, that's a prophetic example. That's from the Sunnah, right? To choose the person who appeals to the people. You know, how do we appeal to them? How do we speak to them in a language that they understand, in a manner that they understand, with kindness, with empathy? I admit, first of all, I'm not this is a reminder to myself. Tariq al-Diwani, mashallah, he is brilliant at that. He's an absolute gentleman when he addresses, people say there's no such thing as a stupid question. Well, there are stupid questions sometimes, but he never, ever treats the questioner with disrespect. He's always very polite. He always engages with them, even when they're hostile. And I think that's a very prophetic trait, and one that we can all learn from.
Definitely. And you mentioned, Horace, there that you had kind of become disillusioned with the concept of Islamic finance and Islamic banking from once you understood really that the foundational structure of it is a system of money creation in the form of debt and riba, in that is how money comes into existence in this modern financial system, and to try and build an anti-riba system on top of that is essentially impossible. Was it that moment where you read Tariq al-Dawani's book that is when you realized that? And was it before then, did you genuinely believe that this could be achieved, that we could achieve a financial and economic system that was genuinely free of riba in this world?
So I want to be careful here, because there's a perception amongst so-called normies, if I can use that term, that we Bitcoiners are a toxic lot. We call ourselves maximalists and we give ourselves laser eyes. And honestly, that's not very pleasant. That's not very inclusive. I think we form a barrier between ourselves and other people when we do things like that. And Tariq is an example of somebody, I think, who has a superb attitude towards people asking new questions. So I did not have my light bulb moment. I wish I could say yes, I did, but I didn't have my light bulb moment when I read Tariq's book. And I was a friend of his, and we'd met in the city a few times in the 90s, and we got to know each other, and he became my mentor. And today I still seek advice from him. I still see him regularly. And when I read that book, I was still very much and I really want to be careful how I use this word, because I don't want to come across as one of those crypto bros. I was still in the matrix, right? I still believed that the world of fiat finance was good and could do something good. Actually, I started my career in an area of finance called project finance. And project finance is infrastructure, roads, railways, hospitals, schools. This is all good stuff. This is all societally beneficial. And at the time when I entered the industry, I took advice from a senior person in the industry saying, look, I know that even in project financing, it's tainted by riba. You've got to get loans and you've got to raise bonds in order to finance these roads and railways and so on. But, this is beneficial to society. So what do I do? What he said to me was interesting. And by the way, I don't always say this advice to everybody else, because everybody has their own journey. But for me, it was the right thing, because if I hadn't learned those skills in fiat finance at blue chip companies, I wouldn't be able to do what I'm doing now. I wouldn't be able to forge a path in an alternative economic system with credibility, with something that's commercially viable and realistic. And I have people coming to ideas all the time. Brother, I had this idea of a rainbow unicorn. It's an amazing idea, and I just need you to implement it for me. I just need that little thing of implementation. Well, it's all about the execution. That's what it's all about. The idea, 1 million people had this idea, right? We all thought about rainbow unicorns. But it's those guys who can actually execute and make it happen. That's the difference. So when Tariq wrote this book and I read it, I knew that it was profound. I knew there was something in there, but I never really had the orange pill moment until I was giving a lecture in 2017, and it was one of my usual lectures on Islamic finance. And at the end, we had some Q&A, and somebody in the audience stood up. This was a very intelligent and articulate and tech savvy and financially savvy individual who said to me, obviously a very leading question, what do you think about Bitcoin? And I said, I don't know. Is it some kind of, I heard it's some kind of magic internet money. And he said, no, it actually works like this. It's a bit like gold. It's, decentralized, it's divisible, it's fungible, it's all the things that we all know, right? And as I'm listening to in real time, I'm listening to him, and the light bulb is going on in my head. And I'm thinking, oh, whoa, wait, this sounds like some kind of e-gold, digital gold or something. And it sounds like it's something very beneficial in this. So I said to him, I'm so sorry, I don't know the answer, but what you've just described to me is kind of mind-blowing. So if you don't mind, I'm not going to answer right now. I need to go away and research this. And I did. And I started reading up. And that year, I started to go down that rabbit hole and understanding that this industry that I'm in cannot be changed in its current format. This Islamic finance, as long as it sits on a fiat monetary standard, and as long as the vast majority of transactions are transacted using this type of contractum trinius that we're using today, and as long as we're doing this deception and money creation and creating riba itself, even though we apply halal labels on top of it, as long as we're doing that, there's no way we will fix this. So let's remove myself from this situation. Let's set up on my own. Let me research Bitcoin and understand, why is it a sound money? Why do I think it's possibly better than gold? Can we return to a sort of Islamic dinar standard that we once had for 700 years, during which we had incredible progress, economic progress, scientific progress, mathematics, astronomy, arts, literature, philosophy, an unbelievable 700 years of creativity for humankind, not just for Muslims, but for everybody. Greek philosophy would have been lost to Europe if it hadn't been for the Muslims. Europe doesn't understand this, and it's forgotten that past, forgotten that link. So how did that happen? That happened because we had time and space on a sound money standard to engage in higher pursuits. This, I think, is an incredible concept. So I realized that we couldn't do this from the inside in Islamic finance, and left and researched Bitcoin. That's really where my journey starts.
Yeah, I feel like for most Muslims, especially if you're a Muslim who has, you were in almost a fortunate position in that you had seen really behind the scenes of how this all works in the modern system. It gives you very good insight. But once you have, I think it doesn't necessarily take that level of understanding to be able to figure out what's wrong foundationally that makes what would be a more prophetic model of trade and economics to flourish. It makes it largely impossible on a debt-based fiat monetary system. And I think from the lens of a Muslim, it becomes. It seems like similar to many others that I know and myself, that for you it was, the more you learn about it, the more you see how, as a sound money, it can bring us back to almost like our roots. The institutions that really used to thrive for those hundreds of years during which Islamic civilization spread across the globe. I wonder, and if you look at those times, some of the institutions that we built, we had the Waqf providing welfare for everyone. We had a much more equitable system. We had a system that didn't, of course, none of us were there to witness it, but you can see, looking back at history and reading about history, that it was a system that was based a lot more in justice. How much of that institutional and societal element of Islamic civilization for those centuries do you believe could be attributed to having sound monetary foundations?
Probably one of the great advantages of having a sound monetary system is that one has low time preference. So as human beings, we we become more like Khalifa. We're vicegerency. We're a steward of the planet. We're a steward of future generations. We're looking after this planet because it's a temporary abode for us and our children and our children's children. And the next life is more important than this one. So we're the ultimate low time. We should be the ultimate low time preference people. We should have maximum deferred gratification. We store up good deeds in this life for the next life. So if we have a monetary system that encourages us to defer gratification, to save and invest for the future, to invest in long-term projects, the classic example of that is if we use a modern corporate finance technique to measure the value of a project, which we call discounted cash flow modeling, right? It doesn't matter exactly what that means, but DCF basically assigns greater value to profits that happen in the near term than to profits that happen in the long term. So if you're a farmer and you apply this DCF valuation method, you are more likely to intensely farm your land so that within 10 years it'll be desertified than farm it on a sustainable long-term basis so that it's available for your children and your children's children and their descendants for hundreds and hundreds of years. And that is the problem with modern capitalism, with modern corporate finance techniques, is we do not have deferred gratification. We're looking for instant hits. And our entire financial system is about instant dopamine hits. It's borrow, spend, consume, borrow, spend, consume. So if we have power and influence, if we're a banker or if we're the government or if we're the central bank, we say, how can I maximize this borrow, spend, consume model? Because my progress is measured on GDP and the stock market. Then people think I'm doing a great job. So as long as my GDP is high, my gross domestic product, I mean, this is a number that calculates exchange value, not experiential value. I know, Michael, we've talked about this in the past.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't measure literacy rates and suicide rates and divorce rates and the happiness of society, the progress of society. It measures one single measure, which is the value of goods and services. Now, those goods and services might not be good reasons for having those goods and services. So the classic example that a Greek economist called Yanis Varoufakis uses is a forest fire. When the forest fire happens, the forest burns down. Well, you need firemen to put the fire out. You need to pay for fuel. You've got the fire trucks. Then you need to rebuild afterwards. You know, all of that costs money and it adds to the GDP. So actually your GDP has gone up, but actually some experiential value has gone down because you lost a forest. So it's counterintuitive. And we live in a society where we measure the wrong things. So, sorry, I've gone off on a complete tangent there to your original question.
I think it's a good tangent because I think it really highlights this warped perception that you end up with societally when it's built on what I would call rotten foundations of a money that is programmed to lose value over time,
yes.
Deposits created in the form of debt with interest that never itself gets created, which means it's a constant, just this perpetual loop of more loans being issued to pay off old loans. And this is the base of our monetary system. It's very fragile. And it encourages the pursuit of growth in the name of growth
for the sake of
alone,
growth.
Because it needs it to keep that going. And that really distorts, I think, incentives in a society. And it takes us as Muslims, especially, away from, like you said, that really having that low time preference, which is essential to all of our institutions, to what sadaqah, to the waqf, to the family building, to building for the future. So it's a tangent, but it's a very good tangent because it highlights a real problem there, I think.
Yeah, I remember my parents' generation, they used to mend stuff. They used to fix things that went wrong. Whether it was a radio or a washing machine or whatever, they had DIY skills and they'd fix things and put them back together and things would last a long time. And by the time my children's generation has come along, two generations later, you know, they're not mending anything anymore. You know, they're ripping out old things and throwing them away into landfills and buying new things. So they're incentivized to borrow, spend, consume because they have low interest rates and their money is devaluing, sitting in a bank account at 10% per annum. So they need to use it quickly. That's why venture capital firms throw money at bad projects, because they'd rather get rid of the money than have it sitting around as dry powder. It's only losing them money by sitting around. So our incentives are perverse. Fiat money forces us to make bad decisions, forces us to spend when we don't need to spend, and it nudges us into human behavior that is unattractive. We look at the Range Rover sitting on the neighbor's driveway and say, why don't I have a Range Rover? And then we try and finance, an expensive car that we really shouldn't be able to afford. And we don't need, one person driving around this enormous house on wheels. It doesn't make any sense to me. It's a rather odd society that we live in today, where we're not even recognizing the perverse incentives that we have. When we walk about our daily lives every day, not realizing that there's just no reason for us to keep growing on a finite planet, infinite growth on a finite planet. So, something is wrong with our incentives. And I firmly believe that changing our monetary system is a way of fixing those incentives, because then our psychology moves towards building building buildings that last for hundreds of years, rather than prefab huts that fall down within a few years. You only have to look at Tariq Al-Diwani uses the famous example of St. Pancras Station, I think.
Mm-hmm.
You look at the original buildings there are really high quality old buildings. And you can see that all around London as well, and all the sort of great cities. So, we as a civilization, I think we're at a turning point for civilization right now. We're at an inflection point, very much like the onset of World War One, where a number of things are coming together, whether that's polarization in geopolitics, whether that's the monetary system, the dominance of the US dollar is coming to an end, the banking systems are being exposed, the political systems are being exposed. We see, America talks about being America first, but they seem to put another nation before them. And that's being revealed now. So, I think we're coming to a head, and the world is coming to a head. And I firmly believe that a fix of the monetary system is something that will allow us time and space to incentivize us to grow society in a better way, to create buildings and institutions that last for hundreds of years, not a few years, that advance science and technology in ways that are good, not where a tech billionaire can create a company that spies on all of us, right? So I really do think that we're reaching that inflection point, and it's a moment of civilizational change.
Yeah, and it's I could go deep on the historical cycles and how those tend to play out. It's one of my topics of interest, but I'll save the audience that for another time. But it's like you say, there is many things coming to a head at the moment, and historically, these periods of time tend to give way to quite significant changes in monetary systems. It would almost seem like something that is, I guess, an almighty plan, that there is something there for us to fall back on potentially. Not that I want to make any claims around that, but I think it's important that with all of this going on, that everyone, but I say this particularly to Muslims, is to be aware of what's going on, and don't bury our heads in the sand as we maybe historically have done, and especially on the topic of things like riba and broken money, and we kind of bury our heads in the sand and we think it's the system, we can't do anything about it. It's important to be aware of these things and keep your wits about you and look at what else is out there. And when I say that, I don't mean agree with us and say that Bitcoin is an answer here. If you feel that there is a better answer, explore it and ask questions and debate with people.
Absolutely. And I think this topic is not confined to people who work in the field of finance and economics. And one of the mistakes that we make as a community of Muslims is that, whether we are, doctors or nurses or plumbers or school teachers, whether we're worried about the cost of living crisis, which many of us are, whether we're struggling to make ends meet, this is a fundamental subject that whoever we are, whatever our situation, we should be concerned about. It's an important subject for our daily lives and for our children and for our grandchildren. And so it's actually, I think it's mandatory. It's an obligation on us to understand how the world works from a monetary point of view. because one doesn't need to be a finance person to intuitively know that something is wrong with the Islamic banking system. There's something wrong with it when you create money from nothing. Surely that was what was forbidden for us. Surely. How are we allowed to do that? I keep using the example, if a Martian came down to planet Earth and saw what the banks did, that they create money literally from nothing, he'd say, there's a fraud here. This is a fraud taking place. And yet we have an Islamic fraud now. Islamic banking is now the Islamic version of that same fraud. So I despair when I see people in my industry who keep shilling for the banks and saying, look, there's nothing wrong with this. We have to start somewhere. Again, I come back to saying, well, you've had 63 years and you haven't moved on. So you have to accept failure when it happens.
Yes. I think there's something to be said there, isn't there, about the doctrine of necessity, which I think we lean on probably too much as an ummah in general, which is this belief that, I'll let you explain what that means because you will probably do a better job of it than me, but I think it has led us down a path of, like I say, burying our heads in the sand and probably refusing to even acknowledge that there may be alternatives out there.
Yeah, scholars will often grant waivers, allow the common people to do certain things that might not be, it may be haram, may be makruh in certain contexts. But the example that you might use is mortgages. So in Europe, the European Fiqh Council, they allowed Muslims to take conventional mortgages to finance their houses. This was before the advent of Islamic finance being common in Europe. And that was accepted because otherwise, we would be significantly at a disadvantage versus the non-Muslim community. And that's understandable. Whether one can apply the doctrine of necessity to financing a Range Rover when an ordinary family car will do the same job, possibly better, I think is very dubious. So, people will finance their businesses. They will finance maybe buy-to-let properties using conventional mortgages, saying, but brother, everybody does it and riba is everywhere now, so it's normalized, therefore it's acceptable. It's a bit like saying, well, if everybody drinks, why can't I drink as well? I'm not buying that argument. And alternatives do exist now. It requires us to work a little bit harder and to understand it a little bit more and do a bit more research. And sometimes we may pay a little bit more. But we have this, I often, when I go to businesses to help them finance their working capital needs, which is what my company does, we often have this conversation where they say, yeah, but I can go to the bank and I can get 6-7% interest rates. At which point I say, go for it. You do that. If you like that, you go for it. I'm not offering you a bank loan. What I'm offering you is a partnership where I will grow with you. I will be your partner. And I will help you to multiply the revenues and the profits in your business over time. I won't cut you off when my credit line comes to its end. That won't happen. I'm now your partner. I'm incentivized to see you do well for the long term, forever. That's low time preference. That's how we operate. We are not a bank and we don't want to be a bank. And if you want to get 7-8% interest rates, ahlan wa sahlan, go for it. Enjoy yourself. That's not the business that I'm in. So when I see Muslims having this conversation, I do despair a bit because I think to myself, there's a prophetic example of working in harmony with the community. What's the second thing the Prophet ﷺ did when he entered Medina? First, he set up the mosque. Then he set up the marketplace, right? And it was a free market. So you remember there's this hadith about the people coming to the Prophet ﷺ when the commodity prices were becoming high. And they said to him, can you fix these prices for us? And he went away and considered the matter and came back to them. And he said, I can't fix the prices for you. The prices are in the hands of God. And if I were to fix the prices, I might create an injustice on the people. Now that's free markets. Of course, there are checks and balances. Of course, there are protections for the vulnerable. Of course, we have institutions like Awqaf, the endowments that ensure that widows and orphans and the vulnerable are protected and that nobody is left behind. But when it comes to business, when it comes to commodity prices, when it comes to the markets, free markets are an Islamic concept. Yes. And there is even an argument that's been used, at least by one historian that I know, to say that the birth of capitalism occurred during early Islamic times. Now, that's a debatable argument, and we can find for and against that argument. But there's an atom of truth in that. We,
Yeah.
we certainly believe that this idea that prices should be allowed to settle by themselves according to the hand of God. This is a very Islamic concept.
This is and as well, this is what is quite typical of breakthroughs in the way that trade, commerce, and economies uh, operated during that time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and even the generations after who continued those practices and expanded them. Is that these spread around the world in one form or another, and in particular, for, like you say, people refer to it as there is people who would say that was the birth of capitalism, and of course there are arguments. I think the word has obviously become tainted. I think no
Very
doubt
much.
about it. The way that I look at it, it is a thing that I've been thinking on a lot, because to me it is capitalistic in this what Islam encourages, especially if you look back at those times, the caravans. It was not that a caravan would go out with the goods of a collection of capital owners, and then it would become an evenly distributed amongst everyone. That would be a typically modern day state socialism.
Yes.
It certainly wasn't that.
Mhm.
It was shared partnership, equitable distribution between those involved in it, those who did those who managed the wealth on behalf of the capitalists that pulled together. That is capitalistic. It's the formation of capital. It's the deferring of consumption to accumulate capital and then putting it to work.
Yes.
So I think if we look at it in that bare basic format, I think it's a very fair
Very
statement.
fair, and it's very healthy as well. The relationship between the one with capital and the one who deploys the capital is also one that is a relationship of equals, and they are forced to do due diligence on each other. Is this a good manager of capital? Is this a good company? Do they know what they're doing? Is this an investor that I can trust, that I can work with, that I can grow with? And this relationship is symbiotic. A borrower-lender relationship between a bank and a borrower is a very asymmetric master-slave relationship. The bank doesn't care what happens. There was this idea that in the early days when we did Sukuk in about 20, 25 years ago, and we did this big benchmark-sized Islamic bonds, that, a lot of Islamic bankers said, and they still say today, by the way, that, these are asset-backed deals. The investor is taking a risk on the asset. Nothing of the sort. Nothing of the sort. It's a loan, because there is an additional contract in that sukuk. And that contract is called a purchase undertaking. And the contract says, I, the borrower, and I use the word borrower very advisedly, I, the borrower, agreed to pay you, the lender, this is the bondholder, the sukuk holder, I agreed to pay you, the lender, the full value of this loan at maturity. Now, if that's not a loan, I don't know what is, right? You've now guaranteed, using your credit rating, that you will pay back this bond. And we've called it an Islamic bond. And by the way, we happen to benchmark it to the conventional interest rate. So what's the difference? In between, somebody did some special purpose vehicle in which they dragged and dropped some asset like a property or whatever, and put it into this special purpose vehicle. And then they pretended that the special purpose, the property sitting in the SPV is paying a rental income to investors. So it's a real economy transaction. Oh, look, you're taking a real economy risk on this asset, generating a rental income. Nothing of the sort. It's an interest rate, right?
I was thinking about it lately. Given that the natural state of economy should be deflation, a lender under a gold standard, for example, is giving gold to the borrower, right? And he will give it back to him in future in the same amount of gold. So the borrower is actually making the lender a favor. He's giving him more buying power back. The future is like he's saving for him.
That's right.
Yeah.
We're seeing, I'm starting to see Bitcoin lenders who are taking a similar approach. It's not quite the same relationship. And although most, if not all of these are not Sharia compliant, if you could say, lending platforms, there is certainly something that is more wholesome about that approach and lending of fiat money, which is going to devalue over time. And if you're someone with the power of the United States that can print its own money that is used in the majority of trade around the world, then you can go to a nation that produces oil and say, I will buy your oil, but I will only buy it in my currency. And you will finance my purchase by buying my treasuries. So I will borrow from you to buy your oil, and I will never really have to pay back those treasuries because I just keep printing more and more dollars, and I'll inflate away my debt. So it's the perfect trade, the greatest trade in human history. It's the perfect trade. And it's one that keeps the entire world in this state of economic slavery.
Yeah. And I think that's what many people don't realize is they may be outside of the US and they look at something like the mountainous pile of national debt that the United States have accumulated. I believe the repayments on their interest are now greater than their tax receipts, potentially, as a total. And it's the third biggest item on their budget. It varies, it changes from quarter to quarter, but it is there and thereabouts behind military spending and social security, I believe. So you look at this, and maybe if you're outside the US, you look at that and think, well, it's their problem. Well, in fact, I have news for you. It is not.
Everybody's problem.
Everybody's problem, because every time they do this and they grow that pile and they have to print more money to deal with the problem that they keep kicking down the road, it takes from all of us.
Yeah.
It takes from all of us.
It does. And we don't realize it. And that's why I say, whether you're a doctor or a nurse or an electrician or a housewife or a school teacher, it doesn't matter that you're not an expert in finance. Understand what's happening in this monetary system. Understand that when your grocery bill this week is £40 and last year that same grocery basket was £30, you may be told by the government that the CPI, the inflation rate is whatever, 3%. But it's a lot higher than that, because the real cost of what you're buying, these goods and services, is going up much faster than that, perhaps at 10% per annum. And that's how fast your money is devaluing. There's no point leaving it in a bank. So how do you save any surplus that you have in a type of money that doesn't devalue? Well, some people say that's gold. And I respect that. I was always a gold bug for those reasons, because I considered it a store of value, and the basis on which we had 700 years of an incredible civilization and great advancement. But those days have gone, and now 8,000 tons of gold sits in the US and is controlled and is manipulated. And if your name is Venezuela and you ask the Bank of England for your gold back, Bank of England would say, no, sorry, I don't like your politics. And my master in the US told me I wasn't allowed to give it back to you. So there's no freedom there. There's no freedom of money there. We need to have a freedom money. That's what Bitcoin is. It allows communities in Gaza, it allows people in Afghanistan, in Lebanon, in parts of the world where their currency is devaluing at an incredible rate. It allows them to save in a technology that is deflationary and survive. And so they can pass it on to future generations. And so they can build buildings that will last for centuries. And so that they have time and space to devote to scientific advancements and so on. And I think it doesn't matter whether we are a finance person or not a finance person. We have to recognize that sound money is a solution to economic ills.
Definitely. And I think there's
What do you think? Yeah.
Go on, Bashar, go ahead.
No problem. What do you think about Muslims who are pessimists and they say what happened to gold that was co-opted by the US and the big powers will happen also to Bitcoin?
Yeah, it's a good question. First of all, I would say that as an ummah, we are not to be pessimistic. We are to be optimistic. That's prophetic. So even if we knew it was the day of judgment tomorrow, we'd plan to treat today. That's in our philosophy. That's in our core DNA. So that's the attitude that we should have. Always be optimistic and plan for the future. And then the specific arguments against Bitcoin, I'm actually going to avoid going into those, because I'm sure you will have speakers, and you both yourself, I'm sure, are extremely well versed and probably more capable than I am of articulating the rebuttals against, all the reasons why Bitcoin is bad and why, the dollar is good. So I won't go into those. But what I will say is that I think that Muslims have, they've not stepped out. And I'm going to be cautious when I use this matrix term. They haven't stepped out of this comfortable world that they inhabit. And maybe they're doing well. Maybe they've got the nice car and the nice house, and the kids are happy and at school, and there's food on the table, and they're comfortable, and they don't need to worry about these things. Maybe, alhamdulillah, good for them. But the world is not like that. The world is unequal, and the world is an unfair place. And we've created a monetary system that's caused slavery around the world. And if we stop to examine it, we'll see that the reason for that is the US dollar. It's very simple. The US dollar is the root of all evil. You can say the money is root of all evil, but fiat money is really the root of all evil. And if we want to fix that problem and have communities around the world that are empowered themselves, they don't have to be a slave to a foreign state, they don't have to give away their natural mineral resources, that spend more than half their GDP on servicing interest payments to Western banks, then they have to move towards a sound monetary standard. And they have to move as a bloc. OIC nations around the world need to get together. And I know that there are some initiatives in play right now. They need to get together and talk to each other and say, how do we stop this happening? How do we get powerful as a bloc so that we have a form of monetary system that ensures that our currency is not devaluing against real assets? And that those conversations are now taking place. So when Muslims say, Bitcoin, it'll be like gold where it'll be manipulated and held, I say, well, sure, it will be if you allow one or two governments to take control of it. But if there are 100 million wallets around the world, as there are now, and you all take control of them, and maybe you're concerned about the technicalities. Maybe you heard about this hack of Cold Card, and you're worrying that if I self-custody, will it get hacked? And these are all legitimate worries. That's fine. There are alternative solutions. There are what they call multi-institutional custody. By the way, full disclosure, I was an advisor to a company called OnRamp, which is an MIC, multi-institutional custodian. But increasingly, I see that company, OnRamp, is receiving a massive increase in inquiries in the last couple of weeks because of the recent hack. And, there are many user-friendly solutions for ordinary people to save their money in a sound form of money in a way that it cannot be hacked or stolen or expropriated or whatever. So these solutions always exist. And I tell Muslims, be optimistic, because that's what we're advised to do. That's how we're advised to behave, to plant a tree, even if there's Yawm al-Qiyamah tomorrow.
And I think it's always important to think about the solutions in a community framework. And Bitcoin allows that much better than Bitcoin allows that much better than gold, because of this technology of fediments.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Statistics.
I mean, how are we going to pass gold bars around with each other? When I was young, when I was a student, my university Islamic society was visited by a group called Murabitun, who I'm sure you're familiar with. They believe in a gold standard. This is a very laudable aim. I think that the intention is a good one. Unfortunately, it just wasn't very practical. And they lived in their own community, a tiny community, and they traded with each other. And that was how they passed value from one person to another. But you can't step outside of that community and walk into a high street shop and buy a cup of coffee with a gram of gold or however much it costs. And you could argue, the counter argument is, well, you can't do that with Bitcoin either. But increasingly, Bitcoin is being used as a medium of exchange, and that's happening now. So if we all start to adopt it, there's 2 billion of us. If 2 billion of us have adopted Bitcoin as a single form of money around the world, you can't stop its progress. That light bulb moment has to go off for everybody. So I hope that's what we'll achieve with Muslim Bitcoin Summit, for example.
And this is it. And this is why we exist. And this is why many of us are so passionate about it, is to try and encourage people there who maybe have that slightly more pessimistic view, is that, actually come and get hands-on with it. Like, let us help you on that journey of getting hands-on with it, so you can feel the feeling that comes with actually being able to deal sovereignly with your own money and transact with your community.
By the way, that's useful for me as well. I mean, yeah. I'm the first to admit I'm not a technical person. I don't understand the technicalities of Bitcoin. And, I'm going to go to these workshops and I'm going to sit there and I'm going to educate myself. Because although philosophically, ideologically, I've bought into the concept of Bitcoin as sound money, and I do hold it, and I've occasionally used it for transactions, the reality is I'm not a daily user of it. I'm somebody who actually needs to be encouraged to use it on a daily basis and to be paid in Bitcoin as well, which I have done in the past, but it's something that I should be encouraging and doing myself as well.
Yeah, and this is exactly the right place to learn these things as well. And that's why it's important for everyone, no matter how ideologically aligned they are, or perhaps how advanced they are with their understanding or not, or use of it. It's a great opportunity to come and learn from others, because ultimately, yes, it could end up like gold, like you say, Horace, if we let it. And I think the only way that we don't let it is if we use it for what it was meant to be for, what it was meant for. And every person in the planet and on this earth has a different use case, right? Like you say, the world is an unfair place, especially on this system that has perpetuated inequality and extracted largely from the global south and caused great imbalances in the world. And that means that there are some people like us who have it much better than others. We're in the West. We have our problems, but in comparably to everyone else, they are rather minor problems. Our major problem is that money is a terrible long term store of value, and it creates distorted incentive structures in our economy. Yeah. And for us, therefore, a solution right now that we need is just a good long term store of value. Others, maybe even in the West, who need to send money to people abroad, to people in Gaza, to people in Lebanon, to people in various different countries, well, actually, they also need a censorship resistant money that can allow them to transmit value across the globe without the permissions of banks and governments. And then there are others in those places, in places like Lebanon, who have experienced bouts and bouts of hyperinflation, who have the problem of a long-term store of value. They have a problem of even a short-term store of value. Yeah. Their money is
instantly devalued,
and they can get hold of it. And so for them, they need something else entirely, and it serves a different purpose for everyone, wherever they are and whatever their circumstances. There are some who genuinely cannot even make a transaction without a government reaching over and monitoring them, and that for those people, they need a medium of exchange, and it can achieve all those roles, and it does. And I think this is something for Muslims to ponder on. Is that I would invite them to take a look in places like Kenya, and in South Africa and Nigeria and many other places on the African continent, who are really putting the rest of us to shame in their adoption of Bitcoin. There really is amazing things happening out there beyond just hodling. So,
yep, fantastic.
Yeah, I just wanted to wrap up on probably one final question, I think, because we've got through a lot of really valuable stuff here. And I just wanted to ask you, Horace, what would you say is something that you find Muslims generally, especially young Muslims, maybe misunderstand about money?
One of the most common questions that I'm asked is, should I invest in Bitcoin? And I think there's two problems with this. One is that they use the word invest as if it's some kind of security or a stock or a share that they can invest in and make money on. And the next is that I haven't really thought about the ideological idea of Bitcoin. What is Bitcoin for? What is sound money? So I'd like them to stop thinking of it as an asset class, an investment class. I'd like them to think of it as a tool for humanity to reset itself. And if you believe that there's something wrong with the economic system, as many of us do, and many of us are experiencing a cost of living crisis, if you believe that, then start doing some research, spend some time understanding that Bitcoin is not a get-rich-quick scheme. And if people ask me, is the price going to go up next year, next month, next week? I don't know, and I don't care. What I care is, again, this idea of optimism. I care that we can improve society and that we can improve the world. And I believe that money, the monetary system, is probably the major reason why the world is in a mess right now. We've allowed ourselves to be dominated by one nation state. So let's take away that domination. Let's take back control for ourselves as a bloc, as an ummah of 2 billion people. So again, whether we are dentists or nurses or plumbers or whatever, it doesn't matter what our profession is. Get educated on what money is. And that's why I'm hoping people will come to the Muslim Bitcoin Summit. And I hope there'll be more non-finance people than finance bros.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a beautiful message to end on as well, because that really is it. It's Bitcoin is a tool. It is a tool, and it's up to us how we choose to use it as an ummah. And that's really the fight here. So thank you very much. And
Thank you.
yeah, I would just like to remind the audience again that they can get tickets for the summit via the link that we will post in the bio. And we really hope to see as many people there as possible to learn more about these kinds of topics and hear from many other speakers as well. But inshallah, we'll see as many Muslims there as possible, eager to learn. Haris, is there anything you want to leave the audience with? Where can they find you? Where can they learn more?
I'm on LinkedIn more nowadays than on X. X, I seem to have stopped reading since a certain person started owning the platform. So you'll find me there. I also run a company called Cordoba Capital Markets, or www.ccmkts. That's ccmarkets.com. So you can find me there.
Brilliant. Well, jazakallah khair for
Should find
coming
you
on.
on Nostr soon.
Oh, yes.
Inshallah, yes.
Yeah. We hope to see you on Nostr soon.
Inshallah.
We hope to see more Muslims on Nostr as well, building on Nostr and breaking free from those centralized platforms. But there is work to do on those platforms still as well. Many people still to reach. But yeah, fantastic. Well, jazakallah khair for joining us. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you. It was very interesting.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you very much, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Take
Assalamu
care.
alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Assalamu alaikum.